I'm Edward, your host, and it's always a pleasure to gather here with you. Tonight, a special greeting to Brooklyn. Tell us where you're listening from and how you usually prepare for Easter. Remember to subscribe so you never miss our daily stories. Now let's step into tonight's mystery together. Chapter 1. The Violet in the Hymn Book. Fernbury on the Downs observed Easter with the quiet reverence that had characterised the village for as long as anyone could remember. It was a small place nestled in the gentle hills of the Downs, where the grey stone church of St. Bartholomew's stood watch over a cluster of cottages, a modest high street, and the kind of orderly English lives that proceeded from season to season with minimal disturbance. Spring had come early that year, and the hedgerows were already thick with new growth, the air carrying the faint sweetness of wild violets and the sharper scent of cut grass from the churchyard. Miss Jane Marple had arrived in Fernbury 3 days earlier, at the invitation of her old friend Lady Bantry, whose late husband's cousin had left her a small property just beyond the village green. Dolly Bantry, as she insisted upon being called, had grown restless in her widowhood and had taken to spending portions of the spring in various borrowed houses across the country. She had written to Miss Marple with her usual warmth, suggesting that the change of scene might do them both good, and that Fernbury was precisely the sort of place where nothing ever happened. Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know that nothing happening in a village was very often a misleading impression, had accepted with pleasure. She had always found that villages, however peaceful they appeared, were reliable mirrors of human nature in all its complexity. People were much the same everywhere, she reflected, and a small community simply provided a clearer view of the patterns that emerged when individuals lived in close proximity over many years. Easter morning had dawned clear and cool, with a pale sun filtering through high clouds. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry had walked to St. Bartholomew's together for the matin service, joining the steady trickle of villagers making their way along the narrow lane. The church bell had rung with a particular sweetness, and the building itself, when they entered, was filled with the scent of lilies and beeswax polish. Someone had arranged great branches of flowering hawthorn near the altar, and the effect was both simple and lovely. The congregation that morning had been respectably full, though not, Miss Marple noted, overflowing. She recognised the pattern of Easter attendance, the regular faithful, the occasional attenders who appeared for the festivals, and the few who came primarily because it was expected of them. Lady Bantry had pointed out various figures of local importance in whispered asides, her commentary characteristically irreverent, but not unkind. Among those present, one figure had particularly drawn Miss Marple's quiet attention. Mrs. Adelaide Crowther occupied a pew near the front, sitting with the upright posture and composed expression of a woman accustomed to bearing burdens with dignity. She was perhaps 55, slender and well-dressed, in a manner that suggested taste rather than ostentation. Her grey coat was beautifully tailored, her hat trim and elegant, and she wore a single strand of pearls that caught the light when she bowed her head in prayer. Lady Bantry had supplied the essential facts during their walk. Mrs. Crowther was a widow of some 8 years, her husband having been a solicitor of considerable standing before his unexpected death. She had remained in Fernbury, living in the house they had shared, and had become known for her quiet generosity and her tireless work with various village charities. She was much respected, Dolly had added, though not perhaps widely known. There was something rather reserved about Adelaide Crowther, a sense that she kept her own counsel and did not seek intimacy. What had caught Miss Marple's eye during the service, however, was something far smaller and more particular. As the congregation rose to sing the final hymn, Mrs. Crowther's prayer book had slipped slightly, and Miss Marple, standing just behind her across the aisle, had glimpsed what lay pressed between its pages. A violet, fresh and vividly purple, rested against the printed text of the hymn. It was not unusual, of course, for people to press flowers in books, but Miss Marple's keen observation noted something curious. The violet appeared newly placed, yet it bore a distinct crease along its stem, as though it had been carried some distance before being pressed, perhaps in a pocket or a handkerchief, and only lately transferred to the prayer book. It was a small thing, certainly, and Miss Marple chided herself gently for the tendency to notice such trifles. And yet she had learned over many years that small things often told their own stories, particularly when they seemed slightly out of place or at odds with the general pattern of behaviour. A violet in a prayer book at Easter was unremarkable. A violet that had clearly been carried elsewhere first was perhaps worth remembering. The service had concluded with the blessing, and the congregation had filed out into the spring sunshine. The custom in Fernbury, as in many villages, was to linger by the churchyard after the morning service, exchanging greetings and news in the gentle way that marked Easter as different from ordinary Sundays. The atmosphere was warm, the conversations quiet and pleasant, and Miss Marple had the impression of a community that knew itself well and was comfortable in that knowledge. She noticed, however, that Mrs. Adelaide Crowther did not linger long. She spoke briefly with the vicar, a young man named Reverend Pritchard, who looked earnest and slightly overwhelmed by the responsibilities of his first Easter in the parish. She exchanged a few words with an efficient-looking woman whom Lady Bantry identified as Miriam Holt, the parish secretary, and then moved toward the gate with her prayer book still clutched rather tightly in one gloved hand. Several people approached her with Easter greetings, and she received them with courtesy, but Miss Marple observed something in her manner that was not quite ease. There was a tension beneath the composure, a sense that Adelaide Crowther was holding herself together by sheer force of will. Her smile, though genuine, did not quite reach her eyes, and once or twice she glanced back toward the church as though expecting someone or something that had not appeared. Among those who spoke with her was a pleasant-faced woman of perhaps 40, carrying a basket of flowers. Lady Bantry whispered that this was Ruth Ellery, who kept the village's small flower shop and was known for her warmth and discretion. Ruth's greeting to Mrs. Crowther was particularly gentle, and she touched the older woman's arm with what appeared to be genuine concern. Adelaide's response was brief, and she moved on quickly, though not, Miss Marple thought, ungraciously. There was also a tall, rather bookish-looking man of middle age, who removed his hat and spoke to Mrs. Crowther with evident respect. This, Dolly murmured, was Peter Vale, the schoolmaster, a bachelor who had taught in Fernbury for nearly 20 years, and was regarded as both learned and somewhat unworldly. He seemed to search Adelaide's face as he spoke, and she answered him quietly, one hand rising briefly to her throat in a gesture that suggested discomfort. What Miss Marple found most interesting, however, was not who spoke to Adelaide Crowther, but who did not. A distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair and a walking stick stood near the yew hedge, observing the dispersing congregation with an air of benevolent oversight. Lady Bantry identified him without being asked as Mr. Stephen Crowther, Adelaide's brother-in-law who lived in the old rectory that adjoined the church grounds. He was, Dolly explained, something of a village institution, having served on every committee of consequence and having over the years provided financial support to numerous worthy causes. He was precise, upright, and universally admired, though perhaps not universally loved. Stephen Crowther met his sister-in-law's gaze across the churchyard, and Miss Marple saw Adelaide's shoulders stiffen, almost imperceptibly. He inclined his head in a formal acknowledgement, but he did not approach, and she did not go to him. The distance between them seemed to carry a weight that had nothing to do with the few yards of grass and gravestone that separated them physically. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry had walked slowly back to Dolly's borrowed cottage, enjoying the sunshine and discussing the small pleasures of the service. They had barely settled themselves for a light luncheon when the news arrived, brought breathlessly by the daily woman who came to help in the kitchen. Mr. Stephen Crowther had been found dead in his chair at the rectory. The details, such as they were, came in fragments over the next hour. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, had been summoned and had confirmed that death had occurred, probably within the last few hours. It appeared to have been peaceful. Mr. Crowther's heart had been weak for some time, though he had insisted on maintaining his usual activities despite medical advice to the contrary. People said at once, with the confidence born of expectation, that it must have been his heart. What else could it have been? And yet, Miss Marple noticed, the reactions among those who heard the news were curiously uneven. Some expressed shock and genuine distress. Others seemed relieved, their faces relaxing as though a long-held tension had finally broken. and a few, including Miriam Holt when she arrived to speak with Lady Bantry later that afternoon, were almost too composed, as though they had been prepared for this news and had already arranged their responses in advance. Most striking of all was the behaviour of Adelaide Crowther herself. When Miss Marple encountered her briefly on the village street that evening, Adelaide's face was pale, but her manner was steady. She accepted condolences with quiet grace, thanking each well-wisher for their kindness. But Miss Marple observed her hands, which trembled very slightly, and the way she held her prayer book against her chest as though it were a shield. The violet, Miss Marple suspected, was still pressed inside, carrying its small burden of the meaning that only Adelaide understood. As the Easter afternoon faded into a soft spring twilight, Miss Marple sat by the window of Lady Bantry's sitting room and reflected on the day's events. A man had died, apparently of natural causes, at an age and in a condition that made death unsurprising, and yet there had been something in the air of Fernbury that afternoon, something in the silences between the words of sympathy and the carefully measured expressions of grief that suggested a story more complicated than the simple failure of an ageing heart. Small things, Miss Marple thought, often mattered a great deal. A violet creased and carried before being pressed, a prayer book held too tightly, a brother-in-law and sister-in-law who acknowledged each other across a churchyard but did not speak, a silence where bells should have rung. She decided, pay attention to the small things in the days ahead. In her experience, they very often led to the truth. Chapter 2. Easter Morning Without Bells. The peculiarity of the silence was not immediately apparent to everyone in Fernbury, but Miss Marple noticed it within the first hour of Monday morning. The church bells, which should have rung for the early service as they did every day during Holy Week, remained mute. The omission created a curious absence in the fabric of the village routine, rather like a clock that had stopped ticking in a familiar room. One became aware of the silence only because the expected sound had failed to arrive. Lady Bantry, who was not an early riser by inclination, had mentioned it over breakfast with the vague surprise of someone who had registered the fact without quite understanding its significance. Miss Marple, buttering a piece of toast with her usual delicate precision, had made a mental note of it. In a village like Fernbury, where tradition was observed with the regularity of the seasons, such departures from custom were rarely accidental. By mid-morning the explanation had emerged, delivered by Miriam Holt when she called at the cottage to discuss arrangements for Mr. Stephen Crowther's funeral. Miss Holt was a woman of perhaps 48, with the kind of composed efficiency that comes from years of managing parish affairs and maintaining order in circumstances that frequently threaten to dissolve into genteel chaos. She wore a serviceable tweed suit and sensible shoes, and her greying hair was arranged in a style that suggested she had more important concerns than fashion. She explained with an air of mild self-reproach, forgotten to secure the bell ropes after the previous day's matin service. It was unlike her to be so forgetful, she admitted, but the news of Mr. Crowther's death had reached her just as she was completing her usual duties, and in the distraction of the moment the oversight had occurred. The ropes had been left hanging loose, and by the time the sexton had arrived that morning to ring for the early service, they had somehow become tangled in a manner that made them temporarily unusable. Lady Bantry had accepted this explanation with a sympathetic murmur, but Miss Marple observed the way Miriam Holt's hands moved restlessly in her lap as she spoke, folding and refolding the handkerchief she carried. It was the gesture of someone who was not entirely comfortable with her own account, though whether the discomfort arose from genuine forgetfulness or some other cause was impossible to determine. The conversation had turned, as was inevitable, to the late Mr. Crowther himself. Miriam spoke of him with evident respect, describing his many contributions to parish life and his unwavering commitment to the welfare of Fernbury. He had been, she said, a man of the highest principles, one who believed in order and propriety and the proper stewardship of resources. He had served as churchwarden for 15 years, and his advice had been sought on every matter of consequence. There was something in Miriam's tone, however, that suggested a relationship more complex than simple admiration. She spoke of Stephen Crowther with the careful precision of someone describing a superior whose judgment had been final and whose approval had been difficult to secure. Miss Marple had known many such relationships over the years, particularly in village churches where long service created bonds that were equal parts loyalty and constraint. After Miriam had departed, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry had walked together to the rectory, where de Haydock was expected to provide a formal confirmation of the cause of death. The day had grown warmer, and the spring sunshine fell pleasantly across the narrow lane that led past the church. The rectory itself was a handsome stone building of considerable age, set back from the road behind a low wall and a well-tended garden. Someone had planted narcissus along the border, and they nodded gently in the light breeze. Dr. Haydock emerged just as they arrived, a stout, practical man in his 60s who had the forthright manner of someone accustomed to dealing with both illness and the various anxieties it provoked. He greeted Lady Bantry warmly, and acknowledged Miss Marple with the courteous deference due to a lady of her years and evident respectability. His conclusion, delivered with professional certainty, was that Mr. Stephen Crowther had died of heart failure, most probably during the late morning hours of Easter Sunday. The heart had been weak for some years, and death, when it came, had been peaceful. There were no signs of distress or struggle. Mr. Crowther had been found in his favourite chair in the study, his hands resting quietly on the arms, his expression calm. It was, Dr. Haydock suggested, as good a death as one might hope for at his age. Miss Marple accepted this assessment with a thoughtful nod, but she could not help noticing certain details that seemed to resist the neat simplicity of the diagnosis. For one thing, there was the matter of Mr. Crowther's desk, which was visible through the open door of the study as they stood in the entrance hall. It was, as Adelaide had indicated the previous day, immaculately organised. Papers were arranged in precise stacks, pens aligned with geometric accuracy, and a blotter centred exactly in the middle of the leather writing surface. It was the desk of a man who insisted on order in all things, and yet his pocket watch, a handsome gold piece that lay on the corner of the desk, was face down. Miss Marple, who had observed human habits for many decades, knew that people who valued precision in their surroundings rarely placed their watches face down unless there was a specific reason. A watch placed face up allowed one to check the time at a glance. A watch placed face down suggested either haste or intention, neither of which seemed to align with the peaceful death Dr. Haydock had described. There was also the matter of the mantel clock, which Miss Marple noticed as they were shown briefly into the study by Adelaide Crowther, who had arrived to begin the sorrowful task of sorting her brother-in-law's affairs. The clock, an ornate piece in a mahogany case, stood silent on the mantelpiece. Its hand stopped at 9:20. Adelaide, observing Miss Marple's glance, had offered an explanation with the kind of quickness that sometimes betrayed unease. The clock often stopped, she said. It was old and temperamental, and Stephen had kept it more for sentiment than utility. He had inherited it from his father, and though it required regular winding and was prone to stopping at inconvenient moments, he had refused to replace it. Miss Marple had accepted this information with a polite murmur, but she noted the way Adelaide's voice had risen slightly on the word often, and the way her hand had moved to adjust the collar of her dark dress as she spoke. It was a small gesture, but Miss Marple had learned that small gestures often revealed what words concealed. Adelaide Crowther was not, she suspected, a woman much given to falsehood, but she was certainly a woman under considerable strain. The violet, Miss Marple noticed, was no longer visible in Adelaide's prayer book, which lay on a side table near the window. Either it had been removed, or the book had been closed in such a way as to conceal it. Miss Marple wondered, with the mild curiosity that had characterised so many of her observations over the years, what had become of that small purple bloom, and what significance it held for Adelaide. The study itself was a room of considerable comfort, lined with books, and furnished with the kind of solid, well-maintained pieces that spoke of taste and prosperity. A Persian rug covered the floor, its colours muted by age and use. The chair in which Mr. Crowther had died was upholstered in dark green leather, positioned to face the window that looked out over the garden, it would have been a pleasant view on an Easter morning, Miss Marple reflected, with the spring flowers in bloom and the light falling gently across the grass. Adelaide moved about the room with the careful efficiency of someone performing a duty she had perhaps anticipated for some time. She gathered a few papers from the desk, smoothed the cushions on the chair, and adjusted the curtains with small, precise movements. Miss Marple watched her with sympathy, recognizing the particular kind of grief that expressed itself through practical action rather than tears. Some people, she knew, found relief in keeping busy, in maintaining the routines that gave shape to their days, even when the world had shifted beneath their feet. Lady Bantry, with her characteristic kindness, had offered to help with any arrangements that might be needed, and Adelaide had thanked her quietly. There would be a funeral, of course, and various notifications to be made, and the inevitable sorting of a lifetime's accumulation of possessions. Adelaide spoke of these tasks with a calmness that seemed almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple suspected that she had been preparing herself for this eventuality for longer than the mere day since Stephen's death. As they prepared to leave, Adelaide mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Stephen had been particular about his routine even in his final weeks. He had insisted on rising early, on keeping his appointments, on maintaining his involvement in village affairs despite Dr. Haydock's gentle suggestions that he might consider resting more. He had been, she said, a man who believed that one's duty did not diminish simply because one's health declined. Miss Marple heard in these words something more than a simple description of character. There was a note of weariness, perhaps even resentment, though Adelaide suppressed it almost immediately. It suggested a relationship that had been shaped by obligation rather than affection, or the requirements of family duty rather than the warmth of genuine companionship. Walking back through the village, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the various threads that had emerged over the course of the morning. The bells that had not rung, explained by a moment of forgetfulness that seemed uncharacteristic of the efficient Miriam Holt. The stopped clock, dismissed as a common occurrence despite Adelaide's evident discomfort when mentioning it. The watch placed face down on an otherwise immaculate desk. The violet that had been pressed in a prayer book and had now disappeared. None of these things, taken individually, suggested anything more sinister than the ordinary sadnesses and small mysteries that attended any death. And yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that it was often the accumulation of small details, rather than any single dramatic revelation, that pointed toward deeper truths. Human nature, she had observed, expressed itself in patterns, and those patterns could be read by anyone with the patience to notice them. That evening, as she sat with Lady Bantry in the comfortable sitting room of the borrowed cottage, Miss Marple mentioned the stopped clock and the untangled bell ropes. Dolly, who was knitting with the kind of cheerful incompetence that suggested she found the activity soothing rather than productive, looked up with interest. "Do you think there's something odd about Stephen's death?" she asked, with the directness that had characterized their friendship for many years. Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I think," she said at last, "that death is always odd, in the sense that it marks the end of patterns we had come to expect. Whether there is anything more than natural sadness here, I cannot yet say, but I do find myself wondering about certain things." "Such as?" Dolly prompted, setting down her knitting. "Such as why a man who valued order above all things would place his watch face down," Miss Marple said quietly. "And why a clock should choose to stop at precisely 9:20 on the morning of his death, when it had supposedly stopped many times before." She paused, her fingers resting lightly on her own knitting, which lay in her lap. "But perhaps," she added, "I am simply seeing mysteries where none exist. It happens sometimes when one grows old and has too much time for reflection." Lady Bantry smiled. "I rather doubt that," she said. "Your reflections, Jane, have a way of proving remarkably accurate." Miss Marple returned the smile, but her thoughts remained with the silent bells, the stopped clock, and the violet that had been carried some distance before, being pressed between the pages of a prayer book on Easter morning. Time, she reflected, was a curious thing. People measured it, marked it, and sometimes, for reasons of their own, they stopped it altogether. The question was why. Chapter 3. The Rectory Safe Reopened. The matter of the will arose quite naturally on Tuesday afternoon, mentioned first by Miriam Holt in a conversation with the vicar, and overheard quite accidentally by Miss Marple, as she and Lady Bantry paused in the church porch to admire the Easter lilies that still graced the altar. Miriam's voice, though lowered to what she evidently believed was a confidential volume, carried with surprising clarity in the stone spaces of St. Bartholomew's. She was explaining to Reverend Pritchard that Mr. Stephen Crowther had revised his will some years previously, arranging his affairs with the same meticulous attention he had brought to all matters of importance. The bulk of his estate, she recalled, had been designated for various charitable purposes within Fernbury itself, a final expression of the generosity for which he had been known during his lifetime. Miss Marple, who had not intended to eavesdrop but found herself in possession of the information, nonetheless noted the particular phrasing Miriam employed. She had said that Stephen arranged his affairs to provide for the village, and there had been something in her tone that suggested both approval and perhaps a hint of something else, something more difficult to name, pride, possibly, in having been trusted with such knowledge, or perhaps a sense of proprietorship over the memory of a man whose wishes she had helped to execute. The mention of the will had prompted Adelaide Crowther to make a decision that seemed to have been weighing upon her for some hours. That same afternoon, she requested that the old wall safe in the rectory study be opened. The safe itself had not been used for many years, not since before the war, when such things had been more common in houses of a certain standing. Stephen had kept his important papers in a bank vault in the market town some miles distant, and the safe had remained locked, its contents presumably of merely sentimental value. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry had called at the rectory at Adelaide's invitation, ostensibly to offer their continued sympathy and support, but in truth because Adelaide had seemed grateful for company during what promised to be an emotional task. Mr. Haydock had also arrived, along with Miriam Holt, whose presence seemed to be both expected and perhaps not entirely welcome. Adelaide greeted them all with quiet courtesy, though her face showed the strain of the past 2 days. The safe was concealed behind a portrait of Stephen's father, a stern-looking gentleman whose expression suggested he had found little in the world to please him. When the painting was moved aside, it revealed a square metal door set flush with the wall, its brass handle tarnished with oil. Adelaide produced a small key from a bureau drawer, holding it for a moment in her palm as though weighing not merely its physical substance, but the consequences of using it. The lock turned stiffly, protesting years of disuse, and the door swung open with a faint creak. Inside, the safe was surprisingly shallow, containing only a few items arranged with the orderliness that had characterized Stephen Crowther's approach to all things. There was a bundle of papers tied with a length of faded ribbon, a small envelope marked with the single word Fernbury in Stephen's precise hand, and a thin ledger bound in dark green cloth. Adelaide reached for the papers first, her fingers trembling slightly as she loosened the ribbon. The papers proved to be various documents relating to the house and property, deeds and title certificates that had been superseded by more recent versions kept elsewhere. Nothing of particular significance, though Adelaide examined each one with careful attention before setting it aside. The envelope was opened next, and it contained a brief letter in Stephen's hand, addressed to the parish council, and outlining his wishes regarding certain bequests to the church. Miriam Holt. Miriam nodded with satisfaction as Adelaide read the contents aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion that must have attended the reading of a dead man's final instructions. It was the ledger that proved most interesting. Adelaide had opened it with evident reluctance, and her face had grown pale as she turned the pages. The entries were financial in nature, recording various sums paid out over a period of many years, each one accompanied by a date and a brief notation. Most of the notations were cryptic, mere initials or single words that meant nothing to those assembled in the study. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the window, noticed that the entries ceased abruptly some 10 years earlier. The final pages of the ledger were blank, suggesting that whatever arrangement had prompted these careful records had come to an end. She noticed too that some of the later entries were written in pencil rather than ink, and that the pencil strokes were heavier, more emphatic, as though the writer had been irritated by the necessity of using graphite when pen and ink were more suitable. But it was the fourth item in the safe, discovered only when Adelaide reached to remove the ledger, that brought a flush to her cheeks and a sudden stillness to the room. Tucked beneath the ledger, folded with precise creases, was a letter in Adelaide's own handwriting. It bore no date, no signature, and no indication of whether it had ever been intended for sending. Miriam Holt's expression as the letter was produced suggested both surprise and a certain sharpness of interest. Adelaide's hand had gone instinctively to her throat, a gesture Miss Marple had observed before, and for a moment it seemed she might refuse to share the letter's contents. But Dr. Haydock's gentle inquiry, delivered with the kindness of an old family friend, prompted her to read it aloud, though her voice was barely above a whisper. The letter was brief and carefully worded. It asked Stephen to reconsider a decision he had made years earlier, to restore a bequest he had once promised, but later withdrawn. The beneficiary was not named, and the reason for the original promise was not explained. Adelaide's words were apologetic in tone, acknowledging Stephen's right to dispose of his property as he saw fit, but asking nonetheless that he consider the injustice that had been done and the harm that continued through his refusal to amend it. The letter ended with a plea for understanding and a hope that family affection might yet prevail over whatever principle had prompted Stephen's original decision. It was signed only with Adelaide's initial, as though she had written it in haste, or perhaps in a state of emotion that had prevented her from completing even this small formality. When Adelaide finished reading, there was a moment of profound silence. Miriam Holt was the first to speak, her voice carrying a note of puzzlement. She insisted, with some firmness, that no such promise had ever existed, at least not to her knowledge. She had managed Stephen's affairs for 15 years, she reminded them, and she would certainly have been aware of any significant bequest that had been promised and subsequently withdrawn. Adelaide made no reply, but her expression suggested a weariness that went beyond the immediate distress of the moment. Miss Marple, watching her, thought of the many times she had seen pride and principle come into conflict with kindness and mercy, and how rarely the latter prevailed, when the former had been given years to harden into immovable conviction. Dr. Haydock, with the practical wisdom of his profession, suggested that the matter might be clarified by examining the ledger more closely. Adelaide handed it to him without protest, and he turned the pages slowly, his finger tracing the columns of figures and notations. After several minutes he looked up with a thoughtful expression. There had been, he confirmed, a regular payment, made quarterly for many years, always in the same amount, always noted with the same cryptic initial. The payments had ceased, as Adelaide had indicated, approximately 10 years earlier. Whether this represented the bequest mentioned in her letter was impossible to determine without additional information, but the timing was certainly suggestive. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to the ribbon that had bound the papers together. It lay now on the desk where Adelaide had placed it, a length of pale blue silk, perhaps 18 inches long. Both ends had been cut cleanly, not torn or frayed, and Miss Marple noticed that the cuts were doubled, as though someone had trimmed the ribbon to neaten it after the initial cutting. It was a small detail, but it spoke of a particular kind of care, the sort of attention one gave to things that mattered. She observed too that Adelaide's hands, which had been trembling when she first opened the safe, had grown steadier as the contents were examined. It was as though the act of revealing what had been hidden, even incompletely, had brought a measure of relief. The letter had been unsent, but it had not been destroyed, and Adelaide had known it was there waiting in the safe to be discovered. Miss Marple wondered, with the gentle curiosity that had characterized so many of her observations, why Adelaide had left the letter where Stephen might find it, rather than destroying it or keeping it in her own possession. The answer, she suspected, had something to do with honesty, with the desire to make one's position clear even if one lacked the courage to send the words directly. As the small gathering prepared to disperse, Adelaide gathered the items from the safe with careful movements, returning all but the letter to their places. The letter she folded once more and placed in her pocket, as though reclaiming what had never truly belonged in Stephen's keeping. Miss Marple noticed that the ribbon remained on the desk, forgotten in the general movement toward departure. It lay there in a gentle curve, its cut ends precise and deliberate, a small testimony to the care with which some people approached even the smallest of tasks. Later, walking back through the village with Lady Bantry, Miss Marple mentioned the ribbon and its neatly trimmed ends. Dolly, who was less inclined to see significance in such details, jested that Adelaide was simply the sort of person who disliked untidiness in any form. Miss Marple agreed that this was certainly possible. But she found herself thinking of the violet with its creased stem, carried some distance before being pressed, and of the ribbon cut twice to achieve a perfect finish, and she wondered whether Adelaide Crowther's care for small details might extend to matters more significant than the trimming of silk. Time would tell, as it generally did. Chapter 4. A clock stopped at 9:20. The funeral was arranged for Thursday, which allowed sufficient time for relatives to be notified, and for the various preparations that attended such occasions. In the intervening days, Fernbury settled into the particular rhythm that follows a death in a small community, where grief and curiosity mingle with the practical necessities of continuing life. Miss Marple had always found that the period between death and burial was often revealing, not because people spoke with unusual candour, but because the disruption of ordinary routine brought to light details that might otherwise have remained hidden. Patterns of behaviour became visible when the familiar structure was disturbed, rather like the way a receding tide reveals what had been concealed beneath the water. On Wednesday morning she encountered Peter Vale quite by chance near the post office. The schoolmaster was a tall man with the slightly stooped posture that sometimes develops in those who spend many hours at desks designed for smaller occupants. He had a scholarly face, thoughtful and kind, though marked by the faint lines that suggested a temperament inclined toward worry. He greeted Miss Marple with the shy courtesy of someone unused to casual social encounters, and that they fell into conversation with the ease that sometimes exists between people who are both, in their different ways, observers of human nature. Peter mentioned that he had been thinking a great deal about Easter morning, about the service and what had followed. It troubled him, he admitted, that he had spoken with Stephen Crowther so recently before his death, exchanging the usual pleasantries after matins without any sense that those would be their final words. But what troubled him more, he confessed with evident hesitation, was a peculiar detail that had lodged in his memory and refused to be dismissed. Miss Marple encouraged him gently to continue, and after a moment's pause, Peter explained that he had heard the rectory mantel clock strike on Easter morning, though at an odd hour and in an odd manner. He had been walking past the rectory shortly after 9 o'clock, taking his usual route from the church back to his cottage, when he had heard 2 chimes ring out in quick succession, almost overlapping, followed immediately by silence. He had thought it strange at the time, Peter said, because the clock normally struck the hours with measured regularity, and 2 rapid beats followed by nothing was entirely out of character for the mechanism. He had paused, half expecting the clock to continue, but it had remained silent. He had assumed some minor mechanical failure, and had thought no more of it until learning of the clock's stopped hands pointing to 9:20. Miss Marple listened with the attentive stillness that invited confidence, and when Peter had finished, she thanked him for sharing what he had observed. She did not press him with questions, but she did remark in her mild way that clocks were curious things, particularly old ones. They developed personalities over time, she suggested, and their failures were sometimes as meaningful as their faithfulness. Peter had looked at her with a flash of understanding, as though he recognized in her words an acknowledgement that his observation might be significant. He mentioned, almost apologetically, that he had taught mathematics for 20 years, and that patterns in numbers and time had always interested him. A clock that stopped at 9:20, having struck twice at just after 9, suggested to his orderly mind not mechanical failure but deliberate intervention. After parting from Peter Vale, Miss Marple made her way to the small flower shop that Ruth Ellery maintained on the High Street. The shop was modest but charming, its window filled with seasonal blooms arranged with evident care, Ruth herself was engaged in creating a wreath for the funeral, her capable hands working the stems of white roses and lilies into a traditional circular form. She welcomed Miss Marple warmly, gesturing her to a chair near the workbench, and they spoke for a while of general matters before the conversation turned, as conversations in Fernbury inevitably did, to Stephen Crowther's death. Ruth's affection for Adelaide was evident in her tone, and she spoke with genuine concern about how the widow was managing in the aftermath of her brother-in-law's passing. It was when Miss Marple mentioned Easter morning, and the various small details that had emerged since, that Ruth's expression grew thoughtful. She set down the wreath she had been assembling and wiped her hands on her apron, her movements slow and deliberate as though she were arranging her thoughts with the same care she gave to flowers. She had delivered violets to the rectory early on Easter morning, Ruth said. It was a regular order, one that Stephen had maintained for years, though he had never explained its purpose, and Ruth had never asked. She brought them each week during the spring months, leaving them on the doorstep if no one answered her knock. On Easter morning, however, Stephen had been awake and in the garden despite the early hour. He had seemed agitated when she arrived at the gate, more so than she had ever seen him. He had asked after Adelaide with an urgency that had startled Ruth, wanting to know whether she had seen her, whether she had seemed well, whether she had mentioned any particular plans for the day. Ruth had answered truthfully that she had not seen Adelaide that morning, though she knew Mrs. Crowther had been at Matins because several people had mentioned it. Stephen's reaction to this information had been peculiar. He had seemed both relieved and distressed, his hands gripping the gate with unusual force. He had thanked Ruth rather abruptly and had turned back toward the house without taking the violets she had brought, an oversight so unlike him that she had called after him to remind him. He had returned to collect them, Ruth recalled, but his manner had remained distracted, and he had asked her quite suddenly whether she believed people could change their natures, whether the patterns established over a lifetime could be broken by will alone. Ruth, taken aback by the philosophical turn of the question, had answered that she supposed it depended on the person and the pattern. Stephen had nodded, more to himself than to her, and had carried the violets into the house without another word. Miss Marple absorbed this account with quiet interest, noting the time that Ruth specified, 9 o'clock or shortly after, which aligned with Peter Vale's recollection of the unusual chimes. Stephen had been alive and conscious then, troubled by something but physically capable. Dr. Haydock's estimate of the time of death had been imprecise, placing it somewhere in the late morning hours. The stopped clock suggested 9:20, but Peter's observation after the chimes indicated the clock had been functioning at least partially after that time. Ruth mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had noticed Adelaide's prayer book lying on the hall table through the open door of the rectory. She had recognised it by its worn leather cover and the ribbon marker that Adelaide always used. At the time she had thought nothing of it, assuming Adelaide had perhaps called earlier to check on her brother-in-law. But now, in light of everything that had emerged, the presence of the prayer book seemed worth mentioning. Miss Marple thanked Ruth for her recollections and her discretion. Ruth acknowledged the thanks with a quiet nod, returning to her work on the funeral wreath. Her fingers moved among the flowers with practiced grace, but her expression remained troubled, as though she were turning over in her mind the various pieces of information and finding that they did not quite fit together in the way one might expect. Walking back through the village, Miss Marple found herself considering the accumulation of details with the methodical attention she had learned to bring to such matters. The clock that stopped at 9:20, yet struck twice shortly after 9. Stephen alive and agitated at 9, asking urgently after Adelaide. Adelaide's prayer book in the rectory hall suggesting she had been there despite her claim of going directly home after matins. The violets delivered, but their recipient distracted and troubled. And underneath it all, the question Stephen had posed to Ruth Ellery about whether people could change their natures, whether established patterns could be broken. It was the question of someone at a point of decision, Miss Marple thought, or perhaps someone who had already made a decision and was questioning its wisdom. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead many years ago, when old Colonel Bantry had stopped every clock in his house after his wife's death, wanting to preserve the moment when his world had still been whole. Pride sometimes expressed itself in curious ways, she reflected, particularly the pride of men who had spent their lives in positions of authority and control. To stop a clock was to assert dominion over time itself, even if only symbolically. But to stop a clock at 9:20 when witnesses suggested it had been working at 9 required not pride alone but opportunity. Someone had been in that room between the 2 chimes Peter heard and the discovery of Stephen's body. Someone had stopped the clock deliberately, for reasons that remained unclear, but which Miss Marple suspected had everything to do with wanting a particular moment to last, or perhaps to be remembered. That evening she mentioned these reflections to Lady Bantry, who had grown increasingly interested in the various threads emerging from what had initially seemed a simple case of natural death. Dolly listened with her characteristic attentiveness, occasionally interjecting a question or observation, and when Miss Marple had finished, she sat back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. "So you think Adelaide stopped the clock?" Dolly asked directly. Miss Marple considered the question. "I think," she said carefully, "that someone who cared about precision and meaning might stop a clock to mark a moment of significance. Whether that someone was Adelaide, I cannot say with certainty, but the prayer book suggests she was there, and her manner suggests she is carrying knowledge she has not yet shared." She paused, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet room. "The question, my dear, is not only who stopped the clock, but why? And I suspect the answer to that will tell us a great deal about what truly happened on Easter morning in the rectory study." Outside, the evening bells rang for evensong, their sound carrying across the village in the gathering dusk. This time the ropes had been properly secured and the bells rang true. But Miss Marple found herself thinking of the silence that had marked Easter Monday morning, and wondering whether that silence, too, had been a message of sorts, a pause in the usual order of things that marked something ending and something else, perhaps beginning. Chapter 5, The Letter Written and Unsent. The funeral took place on Thursday afternoon under skies that had grown overcast, though no rain fell. The church was well attended, as such occasions generally were in villages where a man's life had touched many others through years of residence and service. Miss Marple observed the gathering with the quiet attention she brought to all social occasions, noting not what people said but how they said it, and more particularly what they did not say at all. Adelaide Crowther bore herself with dignity throughout the service, her face composed though pale, her hand steady as she accepted the condolences offered by the departing congregation. Miss Marple noticed, however, that Adelaide's gaze returned frequently to the front pew where she herself had sat, as though something there continued to claim her thoughts even amid the rituals of farewell. After the burial in the churchyard, a small reception was held at the rectory, attended by those who had been closest to Stephen, or who held positions of responsibility in village life. Miriam Holt had organised the arrangements with her customary efficiency, and the gathering proceeded with the subdued conversation appropriate to such occasions. It was during this reception that Miss Marple found herself in quiet conversation with Dr. Haydock, who had withdrawn to the study with the evident intention of escaping the constraints of social obligation for a few moments. He welcomed her company with a wry smile, gesturing her to one of the chairs by the window. They spoke briefly of general matters before Dr. Haydock mentioned, with the frankness that had characterised their acquaintance, that he had been thinking about the stopped clock and the various details that had emerged since Easter Sunday. He was not, he confessed, entirely satisfied with his original conclusion regarding the time and manner of Stephen's death. Medical certainty, he observed, had its limits, particularly when dealing with elderly patients whose hearts might fail gradually over hours rather than in a single catastrophic moment. Miss Marple listened with interest as he explained that heart failure could manifest in various ways, some sudden and others progressive. A man might experience increasing weakness and distress over a period of time, yet remain conscious and capable of limited activity until the final stages. The stopped clock at 9:20 had initially suggested that as the moment of death, but Peter Vale's account of hearing the chimes after 9 had introduced a complication that Dr. Haydock found professionally troubling. He had examined Stephen's desk more carefully that morning, he admitted, and had noticed something curious about the blotter. There were ink marks consistent with Stephen's usual writing, but there were also faint impressions that suggested pencil work, which was unusual for a man who preferred pen and ink for all correspondence and record-keeping. The impressions were too faint to read, but their presence suggested that Stephen had written something into pencil shortly before his death. Miss Marple mentioned the ledger that had been found in the safe, with its pencil entries that had seemed heavier and more emphatic than the earlier ink notations. Dr. Haydock's expression grew thoughtful, and he wondered aloud whether Adelaide might permit him to examine the ledger more carefully. There were, he suggested, questions about the sequence of events that morning that might be answered by understanding what Stephen had been doing in his final hours. The opportunity arose sooner than expected. Adelaide, moving through the reception with quiet grace, noticed their conversation and approached them with the ledger in her hands. She had been reviewing it, she explained, trying to make sense of the entries and determine whether they related to the bequests mentioned in her unsent letter. She would be grateful, she added, for Dr. Haydock's medical perspective on what the records might reveal about Stephen's state of mind. The three of them settled in the study, away from the murmur of conversation in the other rooms, and Adelaide opened the ledger to the pages that had troubled her most. The entries were indeed cryptic, each one recording a quarterly payment of £20 with only the notation MHN as promised beside it. The payments had continued regularly for nearly 15 years before ceasing abruptly. Dr. Haydock examined the handwriting with professional interest, noting that the ink entries showed Stephen's usual firm script, precise and controlled. The pencil entries, however, were different. They appeared in the margin beside the final ink notation, and while the handwriting was recognisably Stephen's, the strokes were heavier, the letters less even. Someone writing under emotional strain, Dr. Haydock suggested, or possibly someone whose physical coordination had been compromised by illness. Miss Marple asked very gently whether she might see the unsent letter that Adelaide had retrieved from the safe. Adelaide hesitated only briefly before producing it from her pocket, where she seemed to have been keeping it since Tuesday afternoon. The paper was good quality, slightly yellowed with age, and the writing was Adelaide's characteristic careful hand. Reading the letter more slowly now, with the ledger entries before her, Miss Marple noted the particular phrasing Adelaide had chosen. She had asked Stephen to restore a bequest he had once promised, using the word restore rather than make or grant. It suggested something taken away rather than something never given, a withdrawal rather than a refusal. Adelaide confirmed in response to Miss Marple's quiet inquiry that she had written the letter nearly a year ago but had never found the courage to send it. She had placed it in the safe during one of her visits to help Stephen with household matters, intending it as a statement of her position, even if she could not voice it directly. She had known Stephen occasionally open the safe to retrieve documents, and she had hoped he might find the letter and understand her feelings without the necessity of direct confrontation. But the letter had remained where she placed it, apparently unread, until Tuesday's discovery. Stephen had either never opened the safe during the intervening months, or he had chosen to ignore what Adelaide had written. Either possibility, she admitted, was consistent with his character. He had been a man who avoided uncomfortable conversations and who preferred to maintain order by refusing to acknowledge disorder. Dr. Haydock returned his attention to the ledger, examining the pencil notations with renewed interest. There were 3 brief entries, he noted, each one appearing to wrestle with some calculation or decision. The first read, "cannot continue." The second, "must not." And the third, written with particular emphasis, "Adelaide deserves." The sentence was incomplete, trailing off as though the writer had been interrupted or had lost the strength to continue. The handwriting in these final entries was noticeably shakier than in the ink notations, suggesting they had been made recently and possibly under considerable duress. Dr. Haydock's expression grew grave as he studied them. These were not, he said quietly, the writings of a man in robust health. They suggested someone in significant distress, possibly in pain, certainly under emotional strain. Adelaide's face had grown very pale as the doctor spoke. She confirmed what Miss Marple had already begun to suspect, that she had indeed visited the rectory on Easter morning, though not immediately after matins as she had initially implied. She had gone home first, she admitted, and had sat in her cottage for nearly an hour, struggling with her conscience and her courage. The violet in her prayer book had been meant for her husband's grave, she explained, a small Easter remembrance placed there each year, but this year she had carried it with her to the rectory instead, though she could not fully explain why. When she arrived at the rectory shortly after 9 o'clock, she found Stephen in his study, seated at his desk but clearly unwell. He had been pale and breathing with difficulty, and when he saw her, his expression had held a mixture of emotion she found difficult to read. He had asked her, quite directly, whether she had come to press her request about the bequest. Adelaide had answered truthfully that she had come to speak with him, yes, but that seeing his condition, she was more concerned for his health than for any other matter. Stephen had dismissed her concern with characteristic stubbornness, insisting that he had important business to attend to, and that this morning of all mornings he intended to set certain matters straight. He had asked her to open the safe, Adelaide continued, her voice barely above a whisper. His hands were trembling too badly to manage the key himself, and he had wanted to retrieve some documents. She had done as he asked, noting as she did so the letter she had placed there months earlier, still folded and apparently unread among the other papers. Stephen had seen her notice the letter, and for a moment their eyes had met. He had said nothing, but something in his expression had shifted, some recognition or acknowledgement passing between them without words. Then he had reached for the ledger, his movements slow and effortful, and had begun to write in pencil, his fountain pen having apparently run dry. Adelaide had watched as he struggled to form the words, his hand shaking with the effort. She had offered to help, but he had refused, insisting with diminishing strength that he must do this himself. She had seen him write, "Adelaide deserves," before his hand had faltered, and the pencil had slipped from his fingers. She had not known what to do, Adelaide confessed. Stephen had leaned back in his chair, his breathing shallow, his face grey. She had asked if she should summon Dr. Haydock, but Stephen had shaken his head, gesturing toward the mantel clock, with what seemed like urgent intention. Adelaide had not understood at first, but when she looked at the clock and saw it pointing to 9:20, she had realised with a clarity that still troubled her what Stephen meant. He had wanted her to stop the clock at that moment, to mark the time when something changed between them, when years of silence and stubbornness had finally given way to acknowledgement, however incomplete. She had done as he wished, reaching up to still the pendulum, and in that silence she had heard him whisper something she could not quite make out. Dr. Haydock listened to this account with grave attention, and when Adelaide finished, he said quietly that what she described was consistent with a heart under severe strain, possibly experiencing the onset of the final crisis. Stephen might have lived minutes or hours longer, but the emotional intensity of that morning had likely hastened what would have occurred regardless. Miss Marple, who had remained silent throughout Adelaide's confession, now spoke with gentle firmness. "You did not cause his death," she said, "but you did witness it beginning, and you honoured his final wish by stopping the clock. That was an act of compassion, my dear, not of wrongdoing." Adelaide's eyes filled with tears for the first time since Easter Sunday, and she accepted the handkerchief that Dr. Haydock offered with trembling hands. The letter, she said, would remain unsent forever now, but perhaps, in those final moments, Stephen had understood what she had been asking for all along, and had tried in his way to grant it. The pencil entries remained incomplete, their meaning fragmentary but suggestive. Whatever Stephen had intended to write, whatever decision he had been struggling toward, had been left unfinished by death's interruption. But Adelaide's conscience, Miss Marple suspected, was not unfinished at all. It was burdened with knowledge of what had been done and what had been left undone in those final minutes at the rectory on Easter morning. Chapter 6. A Gift Meant for Another. The days following the funeral brought a gradual return to ordinary life in Fernbury, though the questions surrounding Stephen Crowther's death remained unresolved beneath the surface of daily routine. Miss Marple had observed this pattern many times before. A community absorbing an event, processing it through countless small conversations, until the truth emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of remembered details. It was on Saturday morning that Ruth Ellery mentioned the redirected parcel quite casually during a conversation about the flower arrangements that would be needed for the following Sunday's service. She and Miss Marple had been discussing the seasonal blooms available when Ruth's attention had been drawn to a notation in her order book from several years previous. The entry had reminded her of an incident she had long since dismissed as insignificant, but which now, in light of recent events, seemed worth recounting. A parcel had arrived at her shop by mistake some 8 or 9 years ago, Ruth explained, addressed to a name she did not recognise. The postal service in those days had been somewhat haphazard, particularly during the Christmas season when such deliveries were most common. Rather than return the parcel to the post office, Ruth had mentioned it to Stephen Crowther, who happened to be in the shop ordering his weekly violets. Stephen's reaction had been immediate and decisive. He had examined the parcel, noting the unfamiliar name on the label, and had declared that it must have been intended for the rectory all along. The name was clearly a clerical error, he had insisted, and he would take responsibility for the item's delivery to its proper recipient. Ruth, who had no reason to doubt his judgment, had handed over the parcel without further inquiry. She had thought nothing more of the matter until weeks later, when she had happened to mention to Miriam Holt that she hoped the mysterious parcel had reached its intended destination. Miriam had looked puzzled, knowing nothing of any such delivery to the rectory, and Ruth had realised with some discomfort that Stephen's explanation might not have been entirely accurate. Miss Marple listened to this account with careful attention, noting the dates Ruth provided and the particular circumstances that had allowed Stephen to claim authority over something that bore another person's name. It suggested a pattern of behaviour that aligned with what the ledger entries had revealed. Generosity administered according to one man's judgment, with the power to redirect or withhold resting entirely in his hands. Later that same day, Miss Marple encountered Peter Vale in the village lending library, a small room above the parish hall that opened on Saturday mornings for the benefit of Fernbury's readers. Peter was returning a volume on medieval history and selecting another on English legal practices, his choices reflecting the scholarly interest that occupied his leisure hours. They spoke briefly about various matters before Miss Marple mentioned, with apparent casualness, that she had been reflecting on the nature of educational opportunities in small villages. It was, she observed, often the generosity of individuals rather than institutions that made the difference for young people of promise but limited means. Peter's expression grew thoughtful at this observation. He mentioned that Fernbury had once benefited from such individual generosity in the form of a scholarship fund, established years ago to assist talented students in pursuing further education. The fund had supported several young people over the years, Peter recalled, including one particularly gifted student who had shown exceptional promise in mathematics and science. The scholarship had been withdrawn rather abruptly, Peter continued, after some disagreement between the student's family and the fund's administrator. The details had never been made entirely clear, but there had been talk of some social impropriety or failure to meet certain unspecified standards of conduct. The student in question had been forced to abandon plans for university and had eventually left Fernbury to seek employment elsewhere. Peter did not need to identify the fund's administrator by name. The scholarship had been one of Stephen Crowther's charitable initiatives, and its withdrawal had been his decision alone. Peter spoke of the matter with evident regret, noting that the student had possessed genuine talent that might have flourished with proper support. Instead, that potential had been lost to Fernbury, and quite possibly lost altogether, because someone had failed to meet standards that were never clearly articulated. Miss Marple recognised in Peter's careful phrasing the particular frustration of someone who had witnessed injustice but lacked the authority to challenge it. Teachers, she reflected, often found themselves in such positions, seeing clearly what needed to be done but constrained by deference to those who controlled resources and made final decisions. The pattern that emerged from these separate accounts was one Miss Marple had encountered before in various forms. Stephen Crowther had been genuinely generous, providing support and assistance to numerous worthy causes and individuals, but his generosity had come with conditions, explicit or implied, and those conditions had been enforced with the same precision he brought to all his affairs. He had been, in effect, a benevolent autocrat, dispensing charity according to his own judgment of worthiness and withdrawing it when that judgment was not satisfied. The ledger entries recording regular payments to M.H. as promised suggested that one such arrangement had continued for many years before ending abruptly. Adelaide's letter had asked for its restoration, implying that the withdrawal had been unjust or based on false premises. Whatever promise Stephen had made, he had broken it, and he had done so with the confidence of someone who believed his judgment was final and beyond appeal. That evening, as Miss Marple sat with Lady Bantry reviewing these various threads, Dolly remarked that Stephen seemed to have been the sort of man who needed to maintain control, even in his acts of kindness. It was a shrewd observation, and Miss Marple agreed that control appeared to have been central to Stephen's character. He had ordered his world with meticulous care, and he had expected others to conform to that order as a condition of receiving his support. But there was something else in the pattern, Miss Marple suggested, something beyond mere love of control. There was pride at work as well, the particular pride of someone who believed that his judgment was superior to others, and that his standards were the measure against which all behaviour should be assessed. Such pride, she had observed, often led to rigidity, to an inability to forgive minor transgressions, or to acknowledge that circumstances might warrant reconsideration of decisions made in haste or anger. Adelaide's shame, Miss Marple reflected, made more sense in this context. She was ashamed not for herself, but for having allowed Stephen's pride to dictate the terms of charity for so many years. She had known, perhaps, that the withdrawn bequest was unjust, that the scholarship had been cancelled for insufficient cause, that the redirected parcel had never reached its intended recipient, and she had said nothing, constrained by family loyalty or by the same deference that had silenced Peter Vale and others who saw the injustices but lacked the standing to challenge them. The violet pressed in Adelaide's prayer book took on additional significance when viewed through this lens. It had been meant for her husband's grave, a gesture of remembrance and continuing affection, but she had carried it to the rectory instead, perhaps as a symbol of what she wished to say to Stephen but could not voice directly, that love and loyalty had limits, that the dead deserved remembrance but the living deserved justice, that family obligation did not extend to perpetuating wrongs. Miss Marple thought of the many small villages she had known, where power and charity were often concentrated in a few hands, and where the exercise of that power shaped lives in ways both visible and hidden. Fernbury was no different in this respect. Stephen Crowther had wielded considerable influence, and he had used it according to his principles, which were genuine but inflexible. Those principles had created both gratitude and resentment, both beneficiaries and victims, and the balance between them had been maintained only through the silence of those who knew better, but said nothing. Adelaide had broken that silence finally, through the unsent letter placed in the safe. It was an act of courage masked as timidity, a statement made without voice, but with the hope that it might be heard nonetheless. And Stephen, in his final moments, had perhaps heard it at last, had begun to respond with the incomplete pencil entries that suggested remorse, or at least recognition. Whether that recognition had come too late was a question Miss Marple could not answer, but she suspected that Adelaide carried the weight of that uncertainty, wondering whether Stephen's final gesture had been genuine repentance or merely the confusion of a failing mind. Without completion, without the clear articulation of what he had meant to write, the question would remain unresolved. And that irresolution, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire affair. Adelaide would never know for certain whether her years of silence had been finally vindicated, or whether Stephen had died still convinced of the righteousness of his judgments and the necessity of his control. The mystery, it seemed, was less about what had happened on Easter morning than about what had been happening slowly and quietly over many years. And that mystery would require more than observation to solve. It would require understanding the particular burden Adelaide carried and the nature of the bequest she had asked Stephen to restore. Miss Marple suspected that the identity of M.H. and the reason for the quarterly payments would prove central to that understanding. And she further suspected that someone in Fernbury knew the truth, even if they had chosen, until now, to keep it to themselves. Chapter 7. The Ribbon Cut Twice. Sunday brought with it the particular quiet that sometimes follows significant events in small communities, when people gather for worship more from habit than devotion, seeking the comfort of familiar routine rather than spiritual renewal. Miss Marple attended matins with Lady Bantry, noting that the congregation was somewhat smaller than it had been on Easter, though still respectable in number. Adelaide Crowther was present, seated in her usual place, and Miss Marple observed that she appeared calmer than she had in recent days, as though some burden had been partially lifted by her confession on Thursday. The prayer book was once again visible in her hands, though whether it still contained the violet Miss Marple could not determine from her position several rows behind. After the service, Adelaide approached Miss Marple with an invitation to take tea that afternoon at her cottage. The invitation was extended with quiet formality, but Miss Marple detected beneath the courtesy a genuine desire for conversation, or perhaps for the opportunity to unburden herself further. She accepted with equal formality, and they arranged to meet at 4 o'clock. Adelaide's cottage was a modest but well-maintained establishment on the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that showed evidence of careful attention. Spring bulbs had been planted in orderly rows, and the small lawn was neatly trimmed. Inside, the rooms were furnished with the understated elegance that spoke of good taste and limited means, everything chosen with care but nothing ostentatious or excessive. Tea was served in the sitting room, a pleasant space with windows overlooking the garden. Adelaide poured with steady hands, and they spoke initially of inconsequential matters, allowing the ritual of hospitality to ease them into more difficult subjects. Miss Marple had learned long ago that important truths often emerged more readily when they were not pursued too directly, when the conversation was allowed to find its own course, rather than being forced along predetermined channels. It was Adelaide herself who eventually turned the discussion toward the ribbon, mentioning almost apologetically that she had been thinking about the various small details that had emerged over the past week. She had retrieved the ribbon from the rectory study, she explained, recognising it as one she had given Stephen years ago for organising his papers. He had been meticulous about such things, preferring ribbons to clips or folders for documents he wished to keep together, but might need to separate occasionally. Adelaide had always cut her ribbons with particular care, she continued, trimming the ends twice to create a neat finish. It was a habit learned from her mother, who had believed that even small tasks deserved proper attention. When she had seen the ribbon in the safe on Tuesday, she had recognised immediately her own handiwork in the double-cut ends. What troubled her, Adelaide admitted with evident discomfort, was the realisation that the ribbon's presence in the safe meant Stephen had used it for the papers stored there, including the letter she had placed among them. Whether he had noticed the letter before retying the papers with the ribbon, she could not say. But the ribbon itself suggested he had handled the contents of the safe at some point after she had left her message there. Miss Marple listened with sympathetic attention, recognising in Adelaide's words the particular anxiety of someone who had attempted indirect communication, and now wondered whether the message had been received and understood. Adelaide had hoped the letter would speak for her, but the ribbon's reuse introduced uncertainty. Had Stephen read her words and chosen to ignore them, retying the papers as a gesture of dismissal? Or had he simply reorganised the safe's contents without noticing the additional document? The conversation turned, as Miss Marple had gently encouraged it to do, toward Adelaide's marriage and her relationship with Stephen. Adelaide spoke with careful honesty, describing a marriage that had been companionable rather than passionate, built on mutual respect and shared values. Her husband had been a good man, she said, steady and reliable if not particularly demonstrative. His death had been unexpected, a sudden illness that gave no warning and allowed no time for farewells. Stephen had been solicitous in the aftermath, Adelaide recalled, helping with legal matters and ensuring she was provided for. But his solicitude had come with expectations, unspoken but clearly felt. He had assumed a certain authority over her decisions, offering advice that was really direction and support that carried obligations. She had been grateful initially, but as years passed, she had come to resent the presumption that she required constant guidance and oversight. The matter of the bequest, Adelaide explained with Adelaide's obvious difficulty, concerned Stephen's treatment of someone who had been important to both brothers during their younger years. She did not name the person, referring to them only as someone who had fallen on difficult times through no fault of their own. Stephen had promised to provide ongoing support, a promise made jointly with Adelaide's husband before his death. But Stephen had later withdrawn that support, citing reasons that Adelaide believed were based more on pride than principle. Her husband would have been distressed by the withdrawal, Adelaide said quietly. He had made the original promise in good faith, and he would have expected it to be honoured. She had tried to continue the support herself, but her own means were limited, and Stephen had discovered her efforts and put a stop to them. He had insisted that the matter was his to decide, that his judgment must prevail, and that Adelaide's interference was both inappropriate and unwelcome. She had acquiesced at the time, and Adelaide confessed, because she lacked the courage to oppose him directly. Stephen had been formidable when challenged, and she had been newly widowed and uncertain of her standing. But the acquiescence had weighed on her conscience ever since, growing heavier with each passing year, until she had finally found the resolve to write the letter that had never been sent. Miss Marple asked gently about Adelaide's visit to the rectory on Easter morning, encouraging her to expand on what she had revealed on Thursday. Adelaide took a deep breath before continuing, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had indeed gone home after matins, she confirmed, intending to place the violet on her husband's grave later in the day. But she'd found herself unable to settle, troubled by thoughts of Stephen and the unsent letter, and the years of complicity in what she believed was an injustice. The violet had remained in her prayer book, and eventually she had risen from her chair with sudden determination and walked to the rectory. She had found Stephen in the garden first, Adelaide said, which aligned with Ruth Ellery's account of his agitation when she delivered the violets. Adelaide had spoken to him there, though briefly, asking whether he had found her letter in the safe. Stephen had denied opening the safe for months, but his expression had suggested he knew what she was referring to. Their exchange had been tense, concluding with Stephen's insistence that he would not discuss the matter further, and Adelaide's quiet assertion that she had said what needed saying, regardless of whether he chose to listen. She had left then, Adelaide continued, walking back through the village but finding herself unable to return home. Instead, she had walked to the churchyard, thinking to visit her husband's grave and seek some clarity in the familiar ritual of remembrance. But when she arrived, she had found herself still holding the violet in her hand, the prayer book forgotten at the rectory when she had set it down during her conversation with Stephen. She had returned to retrieve it perhaps 20 minutes later, Adelaide said, entering through the side door that Stephen habitually left unlocked. The house had been silent, and she had assumed Stephen was still in the garden, or perhaps had gone to his study. Her prayer book was on the hall table where she had left it, and she had picked it up quickly, intending to leave without further encounter. But then she had heard something from the study, a sound that was not quite a word but suggested distress. She had hesitated, torn between the desire to avoid Stephen and the concern that he might be unwell. The concern had prevailed, and she had gone to the study door, which stood slightly ajar. Stephen was seated at his desk, Adelaide recalled, his face pale and his breathing laboured. When he saw her, he had gestured weakly toward the safe, and she had understood that he wished her to open it. She had done so, using the key from the bureau where it was always kept, and had watched as Stephen reached with trembling hands for the ledger. What Adelaide had not admitted on Thursday, what she confessed now with evident shame, was that she had seen Stephen write the incomplete pencil entries. She had watched as he struggled to form the words, "Adelaide deserves," and she had understood that he was trying to make some acknowledgement, some gesture toward the restoration she had requested. But his hand had failed him, the pencil falling from his fingers before he could complete the thought. And then, Adelaide whispered, Stephen had looked at the mantel clock with such deliberate intention that she had known immediately what he wanted. He had wanted that moment preserved, the moment when he had finally acknowledged her right to ask for justice, even if he could not grant it fully. She had stopped the clock at his silent request, and in doing so she had marked not his death but his recognition of her long silence and his own long stubbornness. Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment after Adelaide finished speaking, allowing the confession to settle in the space between them. Then she said very gently, "You did not harm him, my dear. You simply witnessed his attempt to make amends, incomplete though it was. The ribbon, cut twice for neatness, suggests you bring the same care to all your actions. You would not have done anything to hasten his death." Adelaide's eyes filled with tears and she nodded slowly. "But I did something else," she said softly. "Did something I have not yet told anyone. And something I fear will change how this entire matter is understood." Miss Marple waited, her expression calm and encouraging as Adelaide gathered the courage to continue. Chapter 8. Accounts Balanced by Kindness. The silence in Adelaide's sitting room stretched for several moments before she found the words to continue. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her teacup resting in its saucer, her expression one of patient understanding. She had learned over many years that the most difficult truths emerged in their own time, and that any attempt to hurry them often resulted in retreat rather than revelation. Adelaide rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the lawn. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, as though she had rehearsed these words many times in her mind and was determined to speak them plainly now that the moment had come. Stephen had not died immediately, she said. After the pencil fell from his fingers and she stopped the clock, he had remained conscious for several more minutes, though his breathing had grown increasingly shallow. She had asked again if she should summon Dr. Haydock, but Stephen had shaken his head with what little strength remained to him. He had wanted, she believed, to face what was coming with the same privacy and control he had maintained throughout his life. Adelaide had pulled a chair close to his and had sat with him in silence, watching as his colour faded and his breathing slowed. It had been, she said, a strange intimacy between two people who had lived in proximity for years, but had never truly been close. She had held his hand, and he had gripped hers with surprising strength for a few moments before his fingers had relaxed and grown still. She had known he was gone, Adelaide continued, but she had remained seated beside him for some time afterward, trying to order her thoughts and understand what she should do next. The proper course would have been to summon help immediately, to inform Dr. Haydock and begin the necessary notifications, but something had held her there in that quiet study, something beyond simple grief or shock. On the desk before her lay the ledger with its incomplete pencil entries. Stephen had tried to write something, had perhaps been trying to restore the bequest she had requested, but death had prevented him from finishing what he had begun. The injustice of it had struck her forcefully in that moment, that after all these years, Stephen had finally acknowledged her position, had perhaps intended to make amends, only to have that intention cut short before it could be realised. Miss Marple listened without interruption as Adelaide described what she had done next. She had taken the pencil that had fallen from Stephen's hand, and with great care she had completed the entry he had started. Where he had written, "Adelaide deserves," she had added, "restitution as promised to M.H." The handwriting was not identical to Stephen's, but it was similar enough that a casual observer might not notice the difference, particularly given that the entire entry was in pencil rather than his preferred ink. The act had taken only a moment, Adelaide said, but its implications had troubled her conscience ever since. She had not forged Stephen's will or stolen anything from his estate. She had simply completed a statement that she believed reflected his intention, based on what he had been attempting to write when his strength failed, but she knew that intention and execution were not the same thing, and that what she had done might be viewed as falsification rather than fulfillment. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "You altered the ledger," she said quietly, "to ensure that what you believed Stephen meant to do would be recorded, even though he did not live to record it himself." Adelaide nodded, her face pale. "I told myself I was simply finishing what he had started, that I was honouring his final wish, but I knew even as I wrote the words that I was making a choice he had not explicitly made, that I was into writing what I hoped he intended rather than what he had actually managed to express. She returned to her chair and sat down heavily, as though the confession had drained her of strength. "And there is more," she continued. After I had written those words, I sat for a while longer, thinking about the implications. The ledger was evidence of the payments Stephen had made to MH for so many years. If I left it as it was, with only Stephen's incomplete entry, there would be questions but no clear answers. If I altered it to show his supposed intention, I would be creating evidence that might be used to restore the bequest I had requested. Miss Marple considered this carefully. "And so you faced a choice between truth and justice, or what you believed to be justice. You chose to complete the record, knowing it was not entirely honest, but believing it served a higher purpose." "I chose," Adelaide said softly, "to do what I thought my husband would have wanted had he lived to see Stephen's final gesture. But I have wondered ever since whether I did right, or whether I simply gave in to the temptation to have my way after years of having no say at all." There was a knock at the door interrupting the conversation, and Adelaide rose to answer it. She returned a moment later accompanied by Miriam Holt, who apologised for the intrusion, but explained that she had come on a matter of some urgency regarding Stephen's estate. Miriam's presence seemed to unsettle Adelaide, and Miss Marple observed the way the two women regarded each other, with a mixture of wariness and something that might have been understanding. Miriam had brought with her a folder of documents, and she spread them on the tea table with businesslike efficiency. She had been reviewing Stephen's papers more carefully, Miriam explained, trying to ensure that all his wishes would be properly executed. In doing so, she had discovered something that she felt Adelaide should know immediately. Stephen had in fact made a final change to his will just 3 weeks before his death, though he had not yet signed the revised version. The change removed Adelaide as executrix of the estate and named Miriam in her place. Adelaide's face showed no surprise, only a weary resignation that suggested she had suspected as much. Miriam's expression was more complex, combining satisfaction at having been chosen with discomfort at the circumstances that had prompted the choice. Miss Marple asked gently whether Miriam knew why Stephen had intended this change. Miriam hesitated before answering, and when she did speak, her words came slowly, as though she were choosing them with great care. Stephen had become aware, she said, that Adelaide had been making inquiries about the quarterly payments recorded in the ledger. He had viewed these inquiries as interference in matters that were his alone to manage. The removal of Adelaide as executrix had been his response to what he saw as a challenge to his authority, a way of ensuring that his wishes would be carried out according to his judgment rather than hers. But Miriam had her own confession to make, she continued with evident discomfort. She was the MH referenced in the ledger. The payments had been made to her, or rather to support her elderly mother, who had been in poor health for many years. Stephen had promised to provide this support after Miriam's father died, leaving the family in difficult financial circumstances. The payments had ceased 10 years ago, Miriam explained, not because of any fault on her part, but because Stephen had discovered that she had spoken to Adelaide about the arrangement. He had viewed this as a breach of confidentiality, a violation of the terms under which his generosity had been extended. He had withdrawn the support immediately, and Miriam's mother had suffered considerably as a result before passing away some years later. Adelaide's eyes widened with shock and understanding. "You were the beneficiary," she said. "All this time I thought it was someone from my husband's past, someone he had wanted to help. I never imagined it was you." Miriam nodded, her composure cracking slightly. "Stephen swore me to secrecy. He insisted that charity must be private, that any discussion of it would result in its withdrawal. I kept silent for as long as I could, but when my mother's condition worsened, I asked Adelaide if she knew of any assistance that might be available. I did not mention Stephen's payments directly, but he somehow learned that I had spoken to her, and that was enough." Miss Marple observed the two women as they processed these revelations, seeing in their faces the recognition of how Stephen's pride and need for control had shaped both their lives. Miriam had been trapped by her dependence on Stephen's generosity, forced to maintain silence even when that silence meant isolation and hardship. Adelaide had been kept ignorant of the true situation, her attempts to help thwarted by poor rules she did not know existed. "And so," Miss Marple said quietly, "when you altered the ledger, Adelaide, you were actually completing a restitution to Miriam, though you did not know it at the time." Adelaide looked at Miriam with an expression that combined guilt and sorrow. "I never meant to cause you suffering. Had I known, I would have found a way to help regardless of Stephen's rules." Miriam's response was equally soft. "And I should have told you the truth years ago, instead of maintaining a silence that served no one but Stephen's pride. We were both constrained by his need to control every aspect of his charity, to ensure that even kindness was administered according to his specifications." The afternoon light had faded considerably, and Adelaide rose to light a lamp. In its gentle glow, the three women sat in contemplative silence, each considering the implications of what had been revealed. The mystery of the ledger entries had been solved, but it had uncovered a larger mystery about the nature of generosity and the ways in which even genuine charity could become corrupted by pride. Miss Marple reflected that this was perhaps the saddest aspect of the entire affair. Not that Stephen had been unkind, but that his kindness had been conditional in ways that made it a burden rather than a gift. He had helped people genuinely, but always on his terms, always with the implicit threat that help could be withdrawn if his standards were not met. And now Adelaide sat with the knowledge that she had altered a document to restore what should never have been withdrawn, while Miriam sat with the knowledge that her silence had cost her dearly and had prevented others from knowing the full truth of Stephen's character. The accounts, Miss Marple thought, had indeed been balanced, but not in the way anyone might have wished. Chapter 9. What the Pencil Changed. The conversation at Adelaide's cottage concluded with an agreement that the three women would meet again the following day to discuss what should be done with the knowledge they now shared. Miriam departed with a quiet dignity, carrying her folder of documents, and Miss Marple walked back through the evening shadows with much to consider. Lady Bantry was waiting eagerly for news, her curiosity having been thoroughly roused by the various threads of mystery that had emerged over the past week. Miss Marple recounted the afternoon's revelations, and Dolly listened with the absorbed attention she brought to matters that engaged both her intellect and her sense of justice. "So Adelaide altered the ledger," Dolly said when her account was finished. "She completed what Stephen had started, or what she believed he had started. But was she right to do so? And more to the point, what will happen now that the truth is known?" Miss Marple had considering these questions during her walk, and she answered thoughtfully, "I believe Adelaide acted from conscience rather than self-interest. She saw Stephen attempting to make restitution and interpreted his incomplete words as intention. Whether she was right to complete them is a question of moral rather than legal judgment." She paused, arranging her knitting in her lap. "As for what will happen, that depends largely on what Adelaide herself decides to do. The altered entry in the ledger has no legal force. Stephen's will stands as it was last properly executed, and Adelaide's pencil additions, however well-intentioned, cannot change what is legally binding." The next morning brought a letter from Adelaide delivered by hand, requesting that Miss Marple call at the rectory that afternoon. Dr. Haydock and Miriam Holt would also be present, the letter explained, as Adelaide wished to make a full accounting of events to those most directly involved before determining how to proceed. When Miss Marple arrived at the appointed hour, she found the others already assembled in the study where Stephen had died. The room had been tidied since her last visit, the desk cleared of papers and the air fresher, as though someone had opened the windows to let in spring and dispel the atmosphere of illness and death. Adelaide greeted each arrival with composed courtesy, though the strain in her face revealed the sleepless night she had undoubtedly spent. When all were settled, she began her account with the directness of someone who had resolved to hold nothing back. She described again her visit to the rectory on Easter morning, the conversation in the garden, her departure and return, finding Stephen at his desk in evident distress. She explained how she had opened the safe at his request, watched him struggle with the pencil, and stopped the clock when he indicated his wish that she do so. Then she came to the matter of the altered ledger. She had taken the pencil, she explained, and had added the words she believed Stephen had been trying to write. She had done so believing it was what he intended, what he would have completed had he possessed the strength. But she acknowledged now that belief and certainty were different things, and that she had acted on interpretation rather than explicit instruction. Dr. Haydock listened with professional calm, his expression thoughtful. When Adelaide finished, he asked whether Stephen had shown any sign of awareness after she completed the entry. Adelaide shook her head. Stephen had been fading rapidly by that point, his eyes closed, his breathing barely perceptible. He had died, she believed, within minutes of her finishing the pencil notation. Miriam Holt's face showed a complex mixture of emotions. As the unintended beneficiary of Adelaide's action, she seemed torn between gratitude and discomfort. She asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether Adelaide had known at the time that the MH in the ledger referred to her. Adelaide answered honestly that she had not known, had in fact assumed the initials belonged to someone from her late husband's past. The discovery that Miriam had been the beneficiary and that Stephen had withdrawn support so unjustly had shocked her profoundly. Had she known the truth, she said, she would have acted differently, though she could not say precisely how. Miss Marple had remained silent during these exchanges, but now she spoke with gentle authority. I think it would be helpful, she suggested, to consider not only what happened, but why it happened, and what it reveals about the various obligations we carry towards truth, justice, and compassion. She had their attention immediately, and she continued in her mild, reasonable tone. Adelaide altered the ledger, believing she was completing Stephen's intention. Whether that belief was accurate, we cannot know with certainty. Stephen's incomplete words suggest he was moving towards some acknowledgement of Adelaide's request, but they do not constitute a clear statement of intent. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. And yet, he observed, the emotional shock of that morning clearly contributed to Stephen's death. He was already failing, but the conversation with Adelaide, the opening of the safe, the attempt to write something significant, all of this placed enormous strain on a weakened heart. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Adelaide did not cause Stephen's illness, but she was present during its final crisis. The question is whether her presence hastened his death, and I believe the answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that emotional strain contributed to the heart's failure. No, in the sense that Adelaide did not intend harm, and could not have known that her visit would precipitate the end. Miriam spoke quietly. And the altered ledger? What significance does it have now? Miss Marple considered this carefully. The ledger, as I understand it, is not a legal document. It was Stephen's private record of payments made. Adelaide's addition to that record does not change his will or create any legal obligation. What it does do, however, is create a moral record of what she believes should happen. She paused, allowing her words to settle. The question before us is not what the law requires, but what conscience demands. Adelaide has acknowledged altering a private document. That alteration has no legal force, but it represents her understanding of justice, her belief that the support Stephen withdrew should be restored. Adelaide had been listening intently, and now she spoke with quiet firmness. I have decided, she said, to correct the ledger publicly. I will explain what I did and why, and I will acknowledge that my action had no legal authority. But I will also make clear my intention to restore the support to Miriam that Stephen wrongly withdrew, using my own resources rather than his estate. Miriam protested immediately. You cannot afford such a commitment, Adelaide. Your means are limited, and I cannot accept charity from you when you need it yourself. Adelaide's response was gentle but unyielding. It is not charity, Miriam. It is restitution for years of silence when I should have spoken, for allowing Stephen's pride to determine what justice required. My husband would have wanted this, and I should have ensured it happened long ago. De Haydock cleared his throat. There is still the matter of whether any of this need become public knowledge. Stephen died of natural causes, hastened perhaps by emotional strain but not by any deliberate action. The altered ledger is a private document without legal significance. Adelaide's decision to support Miriam can be made quietly, without explanation or scandal. Miss Marple shook her head gently. I believe Adelaide feels differently. She wishes to be honest about what happened, even if that honesty brings discomfort. Is that not correct, my dear? Adelaide nodded. I cannot continue carrying this knowledge in silence. The village will judge me as it sees fit, but I would rather face that judgment honestly than live with continued deception. There was a long silence as each person considered the implications. Finally, Miss Marple spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of experience and understanding. I would suggest, she said, that there is a middle course between absolute silence and complete public disclosure. The essential facts can be shared with those who have legitimate need to know, the solicitor handling Stephen's estate perhaps, and Inspector Slack if there are questions about the circumstances of death. But the intimate details, the private struggles and small deceptions, need not be aired publicly unless the law requires it. She looked at Adelaide with compassion. You wish to be honest, and that is admirable. But honesty does not always require complete revelation. It requires truthfulness when questions are asked and accuracy when accounts are given. It does not require you to volunteer information that serves no purpose but to cause pain. Adelaide absorbed this wisdom slowly. And if Inspector Slack asked directly about the ledger? Then you answer truthfully, Miss Marple said simply. You explain what you did and why. You acknowledge that it was wrong to alter the document, but you explain the circumstances and your understanding of Stephen's intention. You accept responsibility for your action without claiming it had legal authority. Haydock agreed. That seems both honest and proportionate. The law may take an interest or it may not, but you will have been forthright about what occurred. Miriam added her own perspective. And I will make clear that Adelaide's actions, whatever their legal status, were motivated by genuine desire for justice. Stephen wronged me through his pride, and Adelaide has attempted to right that wrong. The method may have been flawed, but the intention was sound. The meeting concluded with a sense of resolution, if not complete peace. Adelaide would prepare a written account of events for the solicitor, and would make herself available to Inspector Slack should he wish to discuss the matter. She would also begin the process of establishing regular support for Miriam through her own resources, thus, a commitment that both women understood would require sacrifice, but which Adelaide insisted was necessary. As Miss Marple walked back through the village, she reflected on the curious nature of the case. There had been no murder, no theft, no obvious crime. Yet there had been deception, alteration of records, and the complicated question of whether emotional strain could constitute a form of harm when it hastened a death that was already inevitable. What the pencil had changed, she realized, was not the legal reality, but the moral accounting. Adelaide had balanced what she saw as an injustice using means that were questionable but motivated by conscience. Whether that made her action right or wrong was perhaps less important than the fact that she had finally broken the silence that had enabled injustice to continue. The scandal, if scandal it was, lay not in what Adelaide had done, but in what Stephen had done over many years. Rationing kindness, withdrawing support on grounds of pride, maintaining control even in acts of charity. That was the real Easter scandal in Fernbury, and it was one that would require more than confession to fully resolve. Chapter 10, Easter Ends and the Truth Remains. Inspector Slack arrived in Fernbury on Tuesday morning, summoned not by any formal complaint, but by Dr. Haydock's professional discretion. The doctor had felt it proper to inform the authorities of the various circumstances surrounding Stephen Crowther's death, particularly given Adelaide's admission regarding the altered ledger. Better, he had reasoned, to invite inquiry than to risk the appearance of concealment. Miss Marple was present at Adelaide's request when the inspector conducted his interview in the rectory parlour. It was a room she had not previously seen, lighter and more cheerful than the study, with windows overlooking the garden where spring flowers were now in full bloom. Someone had placed fresh narcissus in a vase on the side table, and their scent filled the air with gentle sweetness. Inspector Slack was a practical man, more interested in facts than subtleties, and he listened to Adelaide's account with the focused attention of someone trained to detect inconsistencies. Adelaide spoke clearly and without embellishment, describing her Easter morning visit, Stephen's failing condition, his attempt to write in the ledger, and her decision to complete what she believed he had intended. When she finished, the inspector sat back in his chair and regarded her thoughtfully. "You altered a document," he said, though his tone was more contemplative than accusatory. "You added words to a record that was not yours to modify." Adelaide accepted this assessment without protest. "I did," she confirmed. "I believed I was completing Stephen's intention, but I acknowledged that I had no authority to make such additions, regardless of my reasoning." Inspector Slack turned to Dr. Haydock. "And in your medical opinion, the emotional strain of that morning contributed to Mr. Crowther's death?" Dr. Haydock chose his words carefully. "Stephen Crowther's heart was severely weakened. He might have died at any moment, or he might have lingered for days or even weeks. The events of Easter morning placed strain on an already compromised organ. Whether that strain hastened death by minutes, hours, or not at all, I cannot say with medical certainty." The inspector considered this, then addressed Miss Marple directly. "You've been observing all of this, I understand. You have thoughts on the matter?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "I have observed that Mr. Crowther exercised considerable control over charitable matters in this village, often with admirable generosity, but sometimes with conditions that seemed more concerned with maintaining authority than with genuine kindness. Adelaide's action, while technically improper, was an attempt to correct what she perceived as an injustice that Stephen had himself begun to acknowledge." She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the handle of her handbag. "The alteration of the ledger has no legal force. It does not change the will or create binding obligations. It represents only Adelaide's understanding of what should be done, based on incomplete evidence of Stephen's final intention." Inspector Slack drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair, clearly weighing various considerations. Finally, he spoke with the decisiveness of someone who had reached a conclusion. "There is no crime here that I can see. Mrs. Crowther altered a private document, which is irregular, but not criminal when the document has no legal standing. Mr. Crowther died of natural causes, hastened perhaps by emotional strain, but not by any deliberate action intended to cause harm." He looked at Adelaide with unexpected kindness. "You should have left the ledger as it was and made your own decision about supporting Miss Holt independently. But I understand why you did what you did, and I see no purpose in pursuing the matter further. The alteration was wrong in method, but not, I think, in spirit." Adelaide's relief was visible, though she maintained her composure. "I accept your judgment, Inspector. I have already begun making arrangements to support Miriam from my own resources, and I will ensure that the altered ledger is clearly marked to show which entries are original and which were added by me." The inspector nodded his approval. "That seems a sensible resolution. As for the village, they will make their own judgments regardless of what I say, but there is a difference between scandal and sadness, and I believe this is more the latter than the former." After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple remained with Adelaide for a while, sitting companionably in the sunny parlour. They spoke of various matters, including Adelaide's plans for the future and her hope that Fernbury might judge her with understanding rather than condemnation. "The village will talk," Miss Marple observed gently. "That is the nature of villages, but I think you will find more sympathy than censure. People understand the burden of difficult choices, even if they might have chosen differently themselves." Adelaide managed a small smile. "I hope you are right. I have lived here long enough to know that scandal fades, but I would prefer not to be remembered primarily for this affair." "You will be remembered," Miss Marple assured her, "for the support you provide to Miriam, for the honesty you showed in difficult circumstances, and for the courage it took to challenge a system that had operated unchallenged for too long. Those are not small things. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked with Lady Bantry to the churchyard, where the bells were ringing for evensong. The sound carried clearly across the village, marking the hours with reliable constancy. They paused at the gate, listening to the familiar cadence. "So it ends quietly," Dolly remarked, "with understanding rather than punishment, with restitution rather than revenge." Miss Marple considered this. "I'm not certain it has ended," she said, thoughtfully. "Adelaide will carry the knowledge of what she did for the rest of her life. Miriam will carry the knowledge of what Stephen's pride cost her. The village will carry the memory of a man whose charity was genuine but flawed by the need for control. These things do not simply end, they settle into the fabric of a community and become part of its history." They walked slowly among the gravestones, noting the spring flowers that had been placed on various plots. Someone had left violets on Adelaide's husband's grave, a simple tribute that suggested Adelaide had finally completed the task she had intended on Easter morning. "The violet in the hymn book," Dolly said suddenly. "That's where it all began, with you noticing that small detail." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Small details often tell the largest stories. A violet carried from elsewhere before being pressed. A clock stopped at a significant moment. A ribbon cut twice for neatness. These things speak of character and intention if one pays attention to them." They had reached the church entrance where Reverend Pritchard stood greeting those arriving for the service. He welcomed them warmly, and they settled into a pew near the back, where Miss Marple preferred to sit when attending services in unfamiliar churches. The service was simple and traditional, the familiar liturgy offering comfort through its very predictability. When it concluded and the congregation began to disperse, Miss Marple noticed Adelaide speaking quietly with Miriam near the door. Their conversation appeared easy, unburdened by the tensions that had marked their earlier interactions. Whatever judgment Fernbury might render, these two women had clearly reached their own understanding. Walking back to Lady Bantry's cottage in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple found herself thinking about Easter and its meanings. The season spoke of resurrection and renewal, but it also spoke of sacrifice and the laying down of burdens. Adelaide had laid down her silence. Stephen had laid down his life while attempting to lay down his pride, and Miriam had laid down years of resentment in favour of acceptance and forgiveness. "You're very quiet," Dolly observed. "Are you satisfied with how this resolved?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Satisfied is perhaps too strong a word. Resolution in human affairs is rarely complete or entirely satisfying, but I think justice has been served after a fashion, and that is more than can be said for many situations I have observed. She paused at the cottage gate, looking back toward the village where lights were beginning to appear in windows. Easter is not only about rising, as I mentioned to Adelaide. It is also about laying things down, pride certainly, but also burdens we were never meant to carry alone, secrets that grow heavier with time, and the illusion that we can control all outcomes through sheer force of will. Dolly smiled at her friends, or wisdom. Stephen Crowther learned that lesson too late, I think. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. But Adelaide learned it in time, and that may be the more important thing. She laid down her silence and took up her responsibility.